If you study Europe's long winters closely, one thing becomes immediately clear. Survival depended less on farming skill and more on storage intelligence. Long before electricity, refrigeration, or chemical preservatives, European households, monasteries, and frontier settlements relied on a pantry system so effective that it kept food edible for months through deep winter. This was not luck, tradition, or superstition. It was applied environmental engineering refined over centuries of war, famine, siege, and migration. What we now call forgotten was once considered basic knowledge, and, well, understanding it reveals how ordinary people outlasted winters that modern homes often struggle to manage. The winter pantry was designed as part of the building, not an afterthought. Across medieval and early modern Europe, the pantry was not a cabinet or storage room added later. It was an intentional architectural feature built into the cold side of a structure. Pantries were placed on north-facing walls or partially underground, often sharing masonry with cellars or earth-packed foundations. Thick stone walls acted as thermal buffers, absorbing cold at night and releasing it slowly during the day. This created a stable temperature zone that rarely rose above spoilage thresholds, even during brief winter thaws. In alpine regions, the Balkans, and parts of Eastern Europe, pantries were sometimes built as detached stone chambers connected by covered walkways. This prevented heat transfer from the living quarters and protected stored food from cooking fires, body heat, and humidity. In siege-prone areas, pantries doubled as ration vaults, deliberately designed to be defensible, dry, and inaccessible to rodents. A modern application is straightforward. A north-facing, unheated room with thick walls, limited airflow, and no direct sun can replicate much of this effect even today. Folks living off-grid or preparing for winter outages can still build or retrofit such spaces using masonry, earth berming, or even insulated concrete forms. Airflow was controlled, not eliminated, and this made all the difference. Contrary to modern assumptions, old European pantries were not airtight. They relied on slow, controlled airflow through narrow vents or slit windows placed high and low in the wall. This created passive circulation driven by temperature difference, allowing stale air and excess moisture to exit without warming the room. Moisture control was critical because, well, rot spreads faster in damp cold than in dry cold. Vent openings were often lined with stone or wood channels angled to block wind and snow while still allowing air exchange. In coastal and river regions, airflow was adjusted seasonally using shutters or removable plugs. During extreme cold, vents were narrowed to prevent freezing damage to certain foods while still maintaining dryness. This principle is easy to apply today. A properly vented cold pantry or cellar does not need fans or dehumidifiers if airflow is slow and constant. Even simple adjustable vents at floor and ceiling height can, dramatically extend food life when used correctly. Food placement followed strict logic based on spoilage behavior. European winter pantries were organized vertically and horizontally based on how different foods reacted to cold, dryness, and airflow. Root vegetables like turnips, beets, carrots, and parsnips were stored low, often buried in sand or straw-filled bins that moderated temperature swings. Cured meats and sausages were hung higher, where airflow was stronger and humidity lower, preventing mold growth. Hard cheeses were placed mid-level, protected from both freezing air and rising moisture. Nothing was placed randomly. Barrels were elevated on stone blocks to prevent ground moisture wicking upward. Apples and pears were stored separately from root crops because ethylene gas accelerated spoilage. Dried grains were kept in sealed wooden chests lined with ash or lime to repel insects. This level of discipline is rare today but entirely replicable. Anyone storing food long-term benefits from separating produce types, controlling vertical airflow, and using natural buffering materials like sand, wood, and straw instead of plastic. Cold preservation relied on thermal mass, not freezing. A key misunderstanding today is the belief that freezing is the ideal preservation state. Historically, freezing was often avoided because, well, repeated freeze-thaw cycles destroyed texture and encouraged rot. European pantries aim to hold food just above freezing, usually between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius, where bacterial activity slowed dramatically without structural damage to food. Stone floors, earthen walls, and stored water barrels provided thermal mass that stabilized temperature. In some regions, ice harvested from rivers was stored in adjacent chambers, separated by thick walls, allowing cold transfer without direct contact. Modern equivalents include concrete floors, stone-lined walls, or even large water containers placed in a cold pantry to stabilize temperature during power outages. This approach remains more reliable than depending solely on freezers. Preservation methods were integrated right into the pantry environment. The pantry, well, it wasn't just storage, it actually supported active preservation. Smoking racks, drying rails, salt barrels, and fermentation crocks were all placed within the same controlled environment. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, salted fish, and cured meats all benefited from that stable cold, which slowed fermentation just enough to prevent spoilage while still preserving nutrients. In Central and Eastern Europe, fermented foods were often buried halfway into pantry floors to help regulate temperature. In Scandinavia and the Baltic, fish and meat were air-dried inside ventilated pantry chambers designed specifically to catch those winter winds. These methods, they remain usable even today. A cold, ventilated pantry is just ideal for fermenting vegetables slowly through winter without needing refrigeration, and it produces more stable and flavorful results than those warm indoor kitchens. Security against pests was, really built right into the design. Rodents, insects, and thieves, well, they posed constant threats back then. Pantry doors were thick, often iron reinforced, and had these raised thresholds to keep out water and pests. Hanging storage kept food up out of reach, and stone shelving helped prevent gnawing. And cats, well, they were part of the system, not just pets. In fortified settlements, pantries were often interior-facing with no external access at all, ensuring food security during raids or sieges. Out in rural areas, detached pantries helped reduce the risk of total loss if there was ever a house fire. So these days, the equivalent would be sealing up access points, elevating your storage, and steering clear of modern materials that trap moisture or let pests nest. Those old solutions still work, mainly because, well, the problems haven't really changed all that much. Power outages, supply hiccups, and those rising food costs have brought back a real interest in low-energy food preservation. The old European winter pantry, it was tough and reliable because it didn't depend on systems that could just quit on you. It leaned on physics, climate, and honestly, a good bit of discipline. Really, anyone living in temperate or cold regions can use these principles right now. Whether you're building a root cellar, fixing up a corner of your garage, or maybe even designing an off-grid home, the logic behind it still holds up. That forgotten pantry wasn't just primitive, it was, well, optimized. If you found value in this breakdown and, want more deep, practical history like this, go ahead and subscribe to Warpaths of Europe. Share this with your fellow historians and survival-minded folks, and help keep these systems alive by understanding how and why they worked.